Part 1. The Whisper of the North Atlantic Gale. Imagine the year is 950 AD. You are standing on a shattered coastline of the North Atlantic, where the sun has vanished for weeks, and the wind, what Vikings called the sea breath, howls at 50 miles per hour. Sleet becomes icy needles, stinging your skin like a warning. Here, winter is not a season. It is a metabolic bomb, draining your warmth slowly, silently, turning your own body into a battlefield of biological betrayal. Most people today think Vikings survived with massive fires and toughness alone. But fire is fragile. Fuel disappears, wet wood collapses into choking chemical soup, and flames die long before the night does. So how did they do it? How did they turn a simple hut into a sanctuary warm enough for a family to sleep, while the world outside froze into a white abyss? The answer was not brute force. It was engineering. A deep, instinctive understanding of thermodynamics that would make modern architects nod in awe. The Viking Clay Wall Method was a living system of earth, timber, and yes, animal dung, fused into a structure that trapped heat with astonishing efficiency. And before we open that ancient secret, ask yourself something uncomfortable. If the power grid failed tonight and the temperature fell to -30, would your modern home still protect you? Or would you discover what the Vikings learned 1,000 years ago, that survival belongs not to the strongest, but to those who understand heat? Welcome to Historia Prime. Let's learn how to survive like a Northman. Part 2. The skeleton of the giant. To understand the Viking Clay Wall Method, we must first uncover the bones of the giant itself. A Viking longhouse, what they called a langhouse, was not a simple stack of logs thrown together in desperation. It was a machine engineered to capture heat, store it, and defend it against the Arctic winds that hammered the northern world like a constant metabolic bomb. At the center of this design was something the Vikings called the Soul system. In the modern world, our homes place the burden of the roof on the exterior walls, demanding they be rigid, load-bearing, and unforgiving. But the Vikings saw that as a trap, a form of architectural biological betrayal. Because a wall forced to carry weight cannot focus on the one job that saves your life in a blizzard: insulation. So they separated the skeleton from the skin. Deep inside the longhouse, they erected 2 rows of massive wooden pillars, sula, often carved from split oak trunks. These pillars carried the entire weight of the roof, relieving the outer walls of all structural duty. The moment those internal giants lifted the load, the Vikings unlocked a secret that modern engineers still respect. A free wall is a warm wall. Because once the walls no longer held the building up, they could be shaped, thickened, and sealed with extraordinary precision. No fear of collapse, no structural compromise, only pure, uninterrupted insulation. The Vikings transformed the outer shell of the house into a wrapped cocoon of protection, a barrier designed to stop heat loss before the chemical soup of the Arctic evening stole a single degree. And they went even further. They curved the walls outward, giving the longhouse the convex shape of a ship's hull. This was not an artistic flourish. It was aerodynamics, centuries before the word existed. When the winter storms came roaring off the North Atlantic, those curved walls redirected the wind, allowing it to slip around the structure instead of slamming into it. By bending the storm's fury, they reduced the wind chill effect on the building envelope, buying precious degrees of warmth that meant the difference between comfort and catastrophe. This was not primitive construction. This was survival physics carved into timber. The Vikings understood that heat must be protected, not simply generated. They knew that a home must act like a living organism, strong bones within, a resilient skin without. And now, as we continue deeper into their forgotten engineering, you'll see how every choice they made was deliberate, calculated, and astonishingly effective against a climate built to kill. Part 3. The flexible membrane. Now we reach the heart of the miracle. the Viking Clay Wall itself. This is where the magic happens and where chemistry becomes survival. Because once the skeleton of the Longhouse stood firm, the Vikings began weaving something remarkable. A living membrane, flexible yet unbreakable. They started with wattle, threading slender hazel or willow branches between the posts. It looked simple, almost delicate, but this lattice was the wooden rebar of the ancient world. It gave the wall tensile strength, allowing it to flex instead of fracture when the Arctic winds struck like a metabolic bomb. Then came the daub, and this, despite its humble appearance, was not mere mud. It was a precision-crafted composite, clay for cohesion, sand for structure, straw for binding. But the Vikings added one more ingredient, an element that modern people often recoil from. Yet it was pure engineering genius. Herbivore manure, cow, horse, any creature that lived off vegetation created a biological slurry filled with partially digested fibers and natural plasticizers. It transformed the clay mixture into something smoother, stronger, and astonishingly water-resistant. What sounds like a primitive mess, what some might mock as chemical soup, was in truth one of the most advanced natural building materials in the medieval world. And when the wall dried, it became something extraordinary. Rock-hard, airtight, impenetrable. A seal tight enough to block drafts, the invisible thieves of heat. Because in a Viking winter, a single draft isn't discomfort, it's biological betrayal. It steals warmth hour by hour, the same way the cold steals life. But the clay wall didn't let heat escape. It trapped every ember's worth of warmth inside, turning the Longhouse into a pressure vessel of survival. It was the ultimate windbreaker, decades, maybe centuries ahead of its time. And here's the question the Vikings force us to ask. Today we obsess over breathability in our buildings, in our clothes, in our gear. But the Vikings knew a truth we've forgotten. When the world outside wants you dead, airtight is life. Airtight is safety. Airtight is survival engineering in its purest form. Are we overcomplicating modern insulation? Or did the Vikings already solve the problem 1,000 years ago? Part 4. The Earthen Blanket. But even the Viking clay wall, this airtight shield against biological betrayal, was not enough to face an Icelandic winter. Because in a land where the wind behaves like a metabolic bomb and the cold seeps into your bones with the patience of a predator, a single layer of protection was merely the beginning. To achieve true thermal stability, the Vikings wrapped their homes in something far older than timber and far wiser than stone. They wrapped them in earth. They built a second layer, a colossal insulating armor made from turf. Across Iceland and Greenland, where trees were rare and winters unforgiving, the Vikings carved thick blocks of living soil, sometimes 2 meters deep, and stacked them around the house until the Longhouse disappeared beneath an earthen cloak. This wasn't decoration, this was survival engineering disguised as landscape. The inner clay wall formed the airtight seal, but the outer turf wall delivered the bulk. Together they created a cavity effect so advanced that modern architects would call it inspired. The Vikings, however, simply called it home. And here's where the brilliance becomes staggering. They didn't use dead soil. They used turf dense with roots. Because as those grasses continued to grow, the roots knitted together, weaving the blocks into a single monolithic shield. A wall that was not just built, but alive. This living armor turned the Longhouse into a fortress of thermal inertia. Cold could not rush inside. Heat could not rush out. The temperature changed slowly, gracefully, like a giant breathing. Even if the world outside plunged toward 30 below zero, the interior remained steady for hours, sometimes days, refusing to surrender its warmth to the chemical soup of Arctic winds. The Vikings didn't fight winter, they smothered it beneath a blanket of earth. And as we look at this ancient, astonishing design, one question comes into focus. Have we forgotten that nature itself is the strongest insulation ever made? Part 5. The Radiant Battery. If the walls of a Viking longhouse were its insulation, then the floor was its battery. And this battery didn't rely on wires, circuits, or a fragile grid. It relied on physics, on ancient thermodynamics, so precise that any modern engineer would pause in respect. Running down the very spine of the longhouse was the Langeldar, the central hearth. But what looked like a simple fire pit was actually a thermal engine. Beneath and around it, the Vikings arranged flat stones with deliberate care, each one chosen for its ability to drink in heat like a thirsty sponge. During the day, as meals simmered and flames licked upward, these stones absorbed every ounce of radiant energy. Even the packed earth below them began storing warmth. And then, when night arrived, something extraordinary happened. The fire shrank to embers, but the heat did not, because now the radiant battery awakened. The stones, far hotter than the surrounding air, began to release their stored energy slowly, steadily, without the need for fuel. Through the long Arctic night, while outside the world slipped into a frozen chemical soup, the ground beneath the Vikings continued to breathe warmth upward, inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat. This was radiant floor heating centuries before anyone had a name for it. A system immune to wind, immune to drafts, immune to the biological betrayal of cold air stealing your warmth the moment a door opened. The Vikings didn't waste energy heating the air, a substance that vanishes instantly when the storm claws its way inside. They heated the mass. Stone, earth, materials that don't run away, don't evaporate, don't surrender to the metabolic bomb of winter. It was resilience carved into the floor. And so the question falls to us, quiet, uncomfortable, undeniable, which home is truly safer? The modern house that heats air, or the Viking longhouse that heats the earth itself? Part 6. Biothermal integration. Now we step into a detail that shocks most people today, because it forces us to confront a truth we've forgotten. The Vikings didn't heat their homes alone, they heated them with life. At one end of the longhouse, separated only by a low wooden divider, stood the byre, the stable. And in that stable lived cows, sheep, goats, not as ornaments or burdens, but as thermal allies. Modern viewers may recoil at the idea, imagining a primitive arrangement. But this was not primitive, it was precise. It was biothermal engineering centuries before the term existed. Because every living creature is a furnace. A dozen cows exhale more constant heat than many modern heaters. Sheep radiate warmth that never flickers, never needs fuel, never falls victim to the power outages that plunge our homes into biological betrayal. In the dead of winter, when the Arctic unleashed its metabolic bomb of cold, these animals became living radiators inside the Viking thermal envelope, radiating steady, reliable warmth that blended into the clay walls, the turf shell, and the radiant floor like another layer of heating technology. Nothing was wasted, no ember, no breath, no heartbeat. The Vikings understood something profound. Heat is heat, no matter where it comes from. The biological world offers free energy every moment of every day. And yet modern society has sanitized itself so thoroughly that we've disconnected from this natural exchange. We heat empty rooms. We seal ourselves in sterilized boxes. And we forget that, for most of human history, survival meant collaborating with nature, not shutting it out. So the question lingers, sharp and uncomfortable. Have we grown so modern, so clean, that we've forgotten how to harness the simple, unstoppable heat of life itself? Part 7. The physics of closeness. Warmth inside a Viking longhouse was never just about walls. It was about bodies. It was about strategy. It was about understanding the physics of closeness in a world where the cold behaved like a metabolic bomb, waiting for the smallest mistake. Because the Vikings knew something we often forget. the placement of a body can save a life. They didn't try to heat the entire longhouse evenly. That would have been wasteful, an act of thermal naivete bordering on biological betrayal. Instead, they focused heat precisely where it mattered most, where people slept. Along the inner walls, they built raised wooden platforms called pala. These platforms lifted sleepers 30 to 50 centimeters above the ground, and that single adjustment made all the difference. Cold air sinks, warm air rises, and by elevating themselves into that upper layer, the thermal sweet spot, they avoided the freezing layer of air that pooled on the floor like an invisible chemical soup of deathly chill. But even the pala weren't the Vikings' greatest advantage. The true secret was how they slept. Together. Warriors, elders, children, servants, every person in the household became part of a living thermal system. They pressed close, not out of sentiment, but out of engineering. Body heat is one of the most stable, reliable sources of warmth in nature. When bodies touch, heat doesn't escape, it circulates, it stays, it strengthens. The formation mattered. Children, the most vulnerable, were placed safely at the center. Adults, stronger and warmer, formed the outer ring, a human shield of thermal mass. This wasn't just family, it was infrastructure. It was a survival algorithm written in flesh and breath. Because in the Viking world, isolation wasn't noble, it was fatal. Distance killed, closeness preserved. And as we examine this ancient choreography of warmth, one truth becomes undeniable. Sometimes, the most advanced survival strategy isn't a tool, or a wall, or a fire, but the people beside you. Part 8. The White Hall. You might imagine Viking longhouses as dark, smoky dens of survival gloomy chambers, where firelight barely pierced the shadows. But archaeology tells a very different story. At sites like Tiso, researchers uncovered a detail so surprising, so elegant, that it overturns everything we thought we knew about medieval living. The Vikings didn't accept darkness, they engineered against it. They crafted white halls. To create them, they built specialized kilns, capable of burning limestone at nearly 900 degrees Celsius, temperatures intense enough to transform raw stone into lime. And with this lime, they produced a whitewash that they brushed across their clay walls in smooth, brilliant layers. It was not decoration, it was deliberate optic engineering. Because the moment that whitewash dried, the longhouse changed. The interior walls became reflective, amplifying the flicker of the hearth until a single flame could illuminate an entire room. Whitewashed clay turned dim spaces radiant, defeating the darkness that stalked northern winters like a metabolic bomb waiting to collapse morale and health alike. Even without windows, the home felt open, expansive, alive. But beauty was only half the story. The other half was survival. Limewash is a potent antimicrobial agent. In a longhouse packed with families, livestock, cooking smoke, and the ever-present threat of moisture, it acted like an invisible shield. It killed mold before it had the chance to bloom. It neutralized odors before they fermented into the kind of biological betrayal that sickened entire households. At a time when Europe's great cities drowned in filth, the Vikings wielded chemistry, real chemistry, to keep their homes clean. So a white hall was more than a mark of high status. It was a masterpiece of hygiene, a fusion of light, health, and architecture that pushed their survival systems beyond raw endurance into something astonishingly refined. While the world outside collapsed into a frozen chemical soup of storms and darkness, the inside of a Viking longhouse glowed bright, clean, intentional. This wasn't primitive living. It was controlled, curated, engineered life. Part 9. The Uncomfortable Lesson. So now we arrive at the question that lingers like a cold breath on the back of your neck. What can the Viking Clay Wall Method teach us today? We live in a world padded with thermostats, automated heating, and the illusion of guaranteed comfort. But that comfort is a fragile illusion, because our warmth depends on a system staying on, and the moment the grid flickers, the moment a winter storm tears through the lines, our modern homes transform instantly into cold, hollow boxes, helpless against the metabolic bomb of deep winter. The Vikings never made that mistake. They didn't build houses, they built systems, living systems, structures that worked with the earth instead of fighting it, designs that harnessed stone, turf, timber, and biology with a precision that modern architects still struggle to replicate. They didn't resist winter, they absorbed it, redirected it, outsmarted it, and the Longhouse, this ancient masterpiece of survival engineering, leaves us with 3 lessons carved as deeply as runes in stone. First, stability beats intensity. A home that stays at a steady 15 degrees is safer than one that swings wildly between blazing hot and bone-numbing cold. Heat spikes feel good, but thermal stability keeps you alive. Second, community is infrastructure. Sharing space, sharing warmth, sharing bodies. This wasn't sentiment, it was physics. No heater in the world is more reliable than the living thermal mass of another human being. And third, complexity is a trap. Stone, turf, clay, and a bit of biological common sense can outperform fiberglass, electronics, and industrial design when the stakes are absolute. Nature already solved problems we keep trying to fix with technology that collapses the moment the chemical soup of winter storms knocks out the power. So tonight, as you sit in your home, look at your walls. Are they just dividers? Or are they part of a system? A system that protects you, or a system that only works when everything else works? The Vikings knew that warmth isn't something you chase. Warmth is something you protect. And the most important heat of all is the heat you build with the people around you, long before the storm arrives. Thank you for exploring the past with us on Historia Prime. If these forgotten survival systems sparked something in you, hit that like button, subscribe, and join us for more deep dives into the ingenious engineering of our ancestors. Stay warm,